The birdwatcher Mark Cocker has become obsessed by rooks, one of the most familiar but overlooked of our birds. For the next 4 afternoons at this time, he tracks his favourite birds across a year. We begin watching the rooks doing what they will be doing today, getting ready to go to their winter roost. The Rook and Me.
Valley up into the edge of Buckenham itself. Sat in the churchyard looking out across the woods at Buckenham, which is the site where the birds actually come and spend the night and roost. In about 15-20 minutes the whole flock will get up and come over to the trees, so about 5:15, when it's virtually dark, the birds eventually take off from the fields and come up into the trees. So hopefully we'll have an opportunity to see the whole flock pour over in one go, and that's what we're waiting for now. On a blustery afternoon in mid-February, I'm stood on the gently tilting edge of the Yare Valley in Norfolk, just a few miles from my home. We moved here as a family about 4 years ago, and one unexpected consequence of our new cottage was its impact upon my lifelong passion for birds. Previously I'd taken the whole of this wildlife-rich county as a field for my ornithology, but the River Yare, bridged only twice in a 20-mile stretch, seemed to cut me off from large swathes of my former haunts. Fortunately, any sense of confinement was quickly neutralized by the happy discovery that the Yare Valley holds large concentrations of a favorite bird, the rook. My birdwatching has steadily evolved into a single species obsession, and for the last 4 years I've been tracking this quintessential bird of our farmland through its complex seasonal cycle. Rooks and humans are key partners in this landscape. The birds probably never lived here until our Neolithic ancestors first cleared the original wildwood and created the open pasture which rooks so love. The pattern of rook behaviour that I'll describe in this week of 4 programs is one that the birds have maintained for the last 5,000 years. I find this connection with the ancient past moving, just as I hope you might be moved to reflect that while you listen this afternoon, all across the country, the rooks will be performing the same wonderful rituals which got me hooked in the first place. What got me interested was the fact that we moved to a cottage across the valley, and by chance our house sits beneath one of the flight lines for the birds. And if you think of the roost as like the hub of a wheel, the flight lines are like radials, spokes of the wheel running out to the circumference, and one of those spokes, as it were, ran across the top of the house, and morning after morning we would hear the birds breaking out of the roost, and then in the evenings we catch these flight lines coming in. And eventually I became intrigued by what exactly was happening, and I came down to the river one November evening. I was just mesmerized by the aerial spectacle that was unfolding before me. Here's this very commonplace, very ordinary bird that most people don't give a second glance at, and it's involved in what I consider one of the most wonderful spectacles in British nature, and no one else seems to be excited by it, and I just feel its specialness is associated with, in a curious way, with how ordinary the bird is in the first place. A key catalyst for my affair with the rook was a discovery that just across the River Yare, no more than a mile from our back door, is the largest winter gathering of rooks probably in East Anglia, and just possibly in the whole of the country, at its maximum about 40,000 birds. I say rooks, but there isn't a roost anywhere that doesn't include a liberal sprinkling of their smaller, mischievous, white-eyed relative, the jackdaw. In the Yare Valley roost there are many thousands of each species, and together they create a wonderfully contrasting sound. Rooks produce a drawn-out, throat-scraping bass music, while the jackdaw's voice has a higher, clipped, dog-like, yapping quality. For me they fit together perfectly, like bright shards of flint embedded in the shoveling gravel roar of noise. This strange crow music reaches its crescendo in the half-light of dusk, when rook roosts also reach a visual climax. the moment when all the assembled birds fly to their nighttime perch together. In midwinter they remain in their nocturnal sanctuary for 16 of each 24-hour period, leaving them just 8 hours a day to find their food. Every dawn the rook roost breaks apart and bursts into the sky, when the birds spread across the entire region to forage. I monitor this ebb and flow in the Yare Valley, an activity I've come to think of as rooking. In fact, sometimes when people ring to speak with me, my children will say, "Sorry, Dad's not in. He's out rooking," as if my obsession were a commonplace pastime in every family. There are two basic institutions of rook society. The rookery is where they breed, and everyone has experience of them in March when, like daffodils, they're one of the first signs of spring. The other institution which exerts an opposing gravitational pull on them is the roost. And this is where they congregate every night, night in, night out, month after month, probably from about October through to the end of February. And it's a combination of the birds which breed locally, and also large numbers of corvids come to Britain from Scandinavia. So here we are in eastern England. A large number of these birds, both the jackdaws and the rooks, will be continentals. There are two basic theories about why birds roost. One is security. There's obviously security in numbers, and by congregating together they're able to see and detect and, if you like, to sort of fend off predators more effectively. And the second theory, more recent theory, is that they act as a kind of information exchange house. So the birds, some of them will be in an unfamiliar terrain, and it's thought that they watch or observe those individuals which are well fed in the roost, and by associating with those birds that are presumably in very good condition and are giving off a sensation that they fed well, they follow them out of the roost in the morning and return to the sites where the plump, well-fed rook has been feeding the previous day, and so therefore there's a follow-my-leader type process happening with them. Some of these roosts, which are invariably associated with an old rookery, and in this case the rookery itself has vanished but the roost has persisted, can have been there for literally decades, or in some cases hundreds of years. And so, for instance, what I found was that across the river we have the neighbouring village to ours, Rockland St Mary, derives its name from Old Norse for rook. Rock is the old name for rook, and Lund, or Rockland, was derived from the Norse word for a grove. So already the birds were impinging upon the local consciousness. Here you've got now coming across a big vortex of birds coming in our direction, coming from across the river. Some of these pre-roost congregations can involve as many as 1,000 birds. In windy conditions, there's quite a special quality. We've got a rather grim, dark sky with lots of cloud and north wind biting into us, but it seems to trigger off the birds, and there's a sort of exuberant quality, almost as if they're excited by the conditions. And so the flock has an immense playfulness. What happens is they gather and feed on at the pre-roost congregations, and then eventually they will make their way in one huge flock, as we're seeing tonight, these large gatherings of about 500 to 1,000 birds, which all come across to a place that usually adjacent to the roost site itself. So the area near the woodland is a series of fields which they use behind us, and this congregation just gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it's literally one continuous black carpet of birds across the field. And then when that happens, there's an interesting moment. It's a kind of lull before the storm. It's almost as if the birds know they're part of a drama which I'm hooked at, because they are exuberant and noisy and responsive to one another, and then they cease to feed, they stop doing anything, and the whole flock fall silent. There's this weird moment when all the birds know that they're going to fly to the roost, and they're all kind of waiting for the signal to come from some part of the flock. It's difficult to see what triggers it, but at some point, as light is ebbing away and it's getting increasingly dark, all the birds rise up, and that is the moment which I find most exciting. And we'll see that tonight, hopefully. The other thing they do, which is interesting as the birds gather for the last part of the evening, is almost as the day itself, as the light contracts, the birds feel the need to get closer and closer together. So when they've all assembled, as they have now, we're very close to the birds departing for the roost proper, they can be spread out across fields, over several fields, in the immediate vicinity. But one of the other odd things is that they condense and they slowly move closer and closer together, and subflocks will leapfrog the outer perimeter of the gathering on the ground, and they get more and more dense until the whole field is one continuous black carpet of birds. One of the things I find fabulous about this moment, I mean, if you search for a language to describe it, you're almost invariably searching for images that are about marine life, because they remind me more really of a shoal of fish, a dense shoal of fish that's kind of moved by the water, pulsing back and forth. And they sort of turn direction and they suddenly all become visible again as they bank round. We now must have at least, I mean, there's a dense cloud of birds, I suppose somewhere in the region of 30 to 40,000 birds, and they're still pouring out of the fields behind us. Huge black mass. The other thing is the trees, as the birds make their initial moves to get into the trees, but they literally reclothe a bare oak tree with a foliage of black, and then they suddenly all decide that they want to move somewhere else, and the entire flock of birds will suddenly evaporate and the tree becomes a bare winter silhouette again. It's the most extraordinary sight. This is the moment that I found most compelling when I first started to get engaged by rooks, and I just love it every time. It's fabulous.
And so to bed, 40,000 rooks and jackdaws and Mark Cocker. The Rook and Me was produced in Bristol by Tim D. Tomorrow afternoon at the same time, it's spring and the rooks are breeding. Life is a continual onslaught of influences.
Raphael's The Glittering. At this time, we're following a year in the life of a bird obsessive and his quarry. Mark Cocker has reached the spring in The Rook and Me.
For the last 4 years, my life as a professional writer and ornithologist has contracted to a singular and focused obsession with one bird, the rook. While it's undoubtedly one of the most familiar inhabitants of our farmland, the rook's lifestyle is anything but ordinary. In yesterday's programme, the first of 4 on the bird's annual cycle, we encountered them in a winter roost near my home in Norfolk's Yare Valley. In early February, the numbers of rooks and jackdaws congregating in this nightly sanctuary can rise to 40,000, and when they take flight as a single mob, they convert into one of the most captivating visions of the British countryside, a great roiling kaleidoscope of black wings and dark voices. Yet this winter spectacle is far from our more familiar. This is usually a scene of early spring. A skeletal pattern of bare trees is broken by perhaps a few dozen bundles of sticks swaying in the canopy, and from these newly created structures traffic the rooks themselves with a constant supply of fresh twigs. The eventual nests, known collectively as a rookery, are one of the most reliable signs of winter's end. And this spring I'm visiting two of my favourite rookeries close to home. First at Thorpe Hall, 300 pairs. We're sat on the south side of a small village on the edge of the Yare Valley called Thorpe, just near a very large rookery beneath Thorpe Hall. It's early April and we are surrounded on three sides by a horseshoe of coppiced alder and ash trees, and anyone visiting it could not but be impressed by the amount of nests that are smothering the treetops. It's one of the most beautiful rookeries I know for its location, but also for the density of nests. And we're right at the midway point in the breeding season. Birds are now settled on their nests. A lot of them have young birds. The females stay with the young during this period, or stay on the eggs, and the males flow back and forth from the pastures behind us to feed them. And the birds flying up into the trees are usually males, and very easily recognizable because they have these huge distended pouches just beneath their bill. It's called a buccal pouch, which is crammed with worms and invertebrates, and that key factor in their lives, the need for these invertebrates, is the reason that rooks nest so early in the season. They have to find these grassland worms and insects when the soil is still moist, and this determines their early breeding. The reason why they are at such high densities, probably higher here than anywhere else in East Anglia, is because it's a perfect combination for the rook, and it tells us so much about the bird's life, which is the need for grassland close to the nest site itself, but also with access to other habitats. And we're at that borderline between the grazing marshes of the Yare Valley itself to our north, and then to the south you have what we call in Norfolk the uplands, which is probably no more than 10 metres high, but this is all the ploughland, so the birds have access to arable on one side and grazing marsh on the other. And it's rook paradise, basically. But the other fabulous thing, and the reason why I think the rook is such a perfect metaphor for the English landscape, is the persistence of these sites. So if one can, one should try and imagine through time. This rookery has probably been here somewhere in the region of at least 100 years, probably as long as the coppiced alder has been at the height it is. And there's a lovely couple in the adjacent cottage who live in Thorpe itself, who tell me that their grandfather knew of the rookery, and they farmed the land adjacent to this site, and they've known of the rookery all their lives. And I think it's this wonderful persistence of rookeries which makes them such magical colonies of birds. And in a curious way, one of the most fascinating examples of their persistence is a rookery that was in London on the Temple on the banks of the Thames, and this rookery was known at least from the time of the Great Fire of London in 1666, and both Oliver Goldsmith, the 18th century author, and Charles Lamb, the 19th century author, wrote of this particular rookery. And when rooks finally abandoned London for the last time, the last known breeding birds in 1916, they revisited for one season only this old site on the bank of the Thames. And the crucial thing that was lacking from the London of the early 20th century, that had been there throughout London's entire history, was the presence of pasture land. And of course, once pasture goes, once the birds have to travel long distances to find these grassland invertebrates, which are the mainstay of their breeding colonies, the site will disintegrate. And the history of the Temple Rookery in London encapsulates both the bird's ecology and the changing London as well. Just 30 miles away in North Norfolk is the home of Sylvia Cooper, another like-minded lover of the rook. Sylvia enjoys not only the pleasures of her beautiful 70-foot tower residence, whose foundations may date back to the Tudor age. She has the privilege of being neighbour to a rookery, and from the top floor of her remarkable 5-storey house, She can look out on equal terms at the rooks nesting in the crowns of the surrounding trees. It's a rare opportunity to get intimate with these normally wary birds.
As I arrived to look at the tower, I saw the rooks, and somehow I knew that was the place I was going to live, because I'd always loved the rooks and always been around rooks, and I was born in a wood, and the sound has always been part of my childhood. So it was like returning back to Norfolk and to the rooks in a way. And you just follow the year. It starts in February, and I suddenly see that birds will come to gather, and that they'll be flying around with twigs in their mouth. And I know it's time I should get out and be starting my gardening pattern. And then it's the sounds that change throughout the year. And now when they're building the nest, it's reasonably calm, but we're waiting for that squeaking noise when the babies are there. But they're such sociable birds, aren't they? That's what I find amazing. I mean, I live here and I'm quite solitary, but I love the idea of all that sort of social activity going on, because they'll suddenly decide to go into the field together, or they'll go off and fly together.
Do you feel that they keep you company?
Well, they are company. We're sharing the woods. You know, it's theirs as much as mine. They bring the wood alive. It's so different when they disappear in the winter. I still look forward to them coming back.
What's interesting to me is that the rookery is absolutely typical, all the characteristics one would expect, tall trees, which is what the birds usually nest in. We're surrounded by grassland, including your own lawn, which is where the birds will hunt for the worms and invertebrates that they'll feed their young. And then you have beyond that, in this spectacular view, we can see large areas of agricultural land where the birds can also feed and follow feeding opportunities such as tractors ploughing. But what's totally different about your rookery to any other rookery I know is that we're actually in the rookery itself. We're at the level of the nest, which is unique in Norfolk and one of perhaps a dozen places in the whole of Britain where you can actually see rooks on their own terms in their own rookery, which is truly spectacular and fabulously exciting for me anyway. I love it here. I mean, it's difficult to convey without visual opportunities to the audience that we're 70 feet up in the trees, but beyond us we've got views over 25 miles of the Norfolk countryside, and on a good day, today's quite misty and rainy, but on a good day we can see all the way to the sea. We can see Sheringham over in the east and probably almost all the way to Blakeney in the west. It is an absolutely spectacular spot. It's a rook's eye view of a rookery and of their lives. It's just fabulous. We've got birds, almost certainly females. The eggs are laid beginning in about the middle of March, and they lay somewhere between 2 and 8 blue-green eggs with brown spots, which I have to confess I describe from having seen them in books, because I've never actually got up to a rook's nest to see the contents myself. But from this sort of view, we've got view over a rookery in mid-season. A lot of the nests have got the tails poking out, the females sat squat on the nest. And every time that the male returns to the nest, she will quiver her wings. She makes this curious high kazoo-like note with a kind of gulping sound in the middle of it, and he will respond to her actions by cramming invertebrates into her mouth, a kind of worm paste that he shovels down. I don't think one should underestimate what hard work the breeding season is for a pair of rooks, and the male has to keep her totally supplied with food while she's incubating for 3 weeks. He himself has to feed, but then when the young hatch, and there can be anything up to 8 nestlings, all absolutely voracious appetites, he has to fly back and forth constantly. And one of the things I find fascinating is that if you're out at night and you're driving through the countryside, come 4 or 5 o'clock on a May morning and the first grey light of dawn, one of the first birds you'll find feeding is a rook, and I think it's extraordinary what active lives they lead at this time.
What I find fascinating as well is how silent it is at night, because the rooks are not making a sound. And then in the morning, as you say, so early they start to make their sound. So you really notice a contrast between the day and the night.
How do you respond to the sound? of the rooks so close to your house?
Oh, I just love it. Well, I know that when it's quiet and calm, I feel that way myself, that when a night time comes and they're quiet and I know everything's at peace. But sometimes we had a very rainy, stormy night and I could hear them muttering in the night. They actually made a sound at night, which they don't do normally. And so I feel if there was anything untoward happening, that they would be my lookout.
I mean, one of the great things that one has an opportunity to do from a site like this at eye level with the rooks is you can really see how bright they are. I mean, most people think of the crow family in general as just simply black and boring and colourless, but if you look closely at a rook, particularly at this time of year when the plumage is at its freshest, the whole of the head, the sides of the neck, the breast, parts of the mantle are beautifully iridescent, strongly sort of purple tones and blue, rich royal blue, particularly on the head itself. And the plumage is also extremely dense and has a very soft quality, and that sort of enhances the colour which the rook has. If one could set aside its bare patch of skin around the base of the bill, which has an almost reptilian, primitive quality, it can look a very handsome bird, although I'm perhaps making a special case for my special bird. One of the interesting things to me is that we hear rooks, we would certainly find it almost impossible to differentiate one bird, individual bird, from another. What I think is remarkable is that amongst that seeming uniformity of sound which we hear now from this gathering of birds, actually each voice is slightly different, and that therefore when a female is sat on her nest, she may have been sat there for an hour, she may be very hungry, and he returns and he calls to her, and she may well respond by leaving the nest top to be fed by him, perhaps to the side of the nest or whatever, just allowing her to stretch, and she's able to recognize his call. It's actually a series of individuals all recognizing each other's calls, probably recognizing their neighbors' calls as well, which I think is remarkable. There's a fabulous moment over here where the female is quivering her wings and begging, and the male has just returned with a great crop full of food, and he's fed her. She's taken the food very quickly. She's come off the nest. He's scraping his bill, cleaning off any chitin or any insect material that might be left on his bill, and she's fluttering around, perhaps just to shake the rain off, and he's finished his feeding. He'll probably go back out into the fields again. She returns to the nest now, sort of rearranging herself on the eggs probably, and back down she goes, sat on the cup.
There we are, a close-up view of matrimony, rook style. The Rook and Me was presented by Mark Cocker. It was produced in Bristol by Tim D. And tomorrow at the same time, Mark eats his favourite bird in a summer rook pie.
Following... Watch your step in those cowboy boots, Laurie. It's 4:15. The bird watcher Mark Cocker has become obsessed by rooks, one of the most familiar but overlooked of our birds. This week he's been tracking his favourite birds across a year. Today we've reached the summer. The Rook and Me.
My 4-year pursuit of the rook, that gloriously commonplace bird of our agricultural landscape, was one of those chance consequences of moving house. In 2001 we acquired a rambling cottage in the heart of Norfolk's Yare Valley. Little did I realise that our front door lay precisely beneath the flight line for one of the largest gatherings of rooks in all Britain. Observing the birds' twice-daily ritual as they sailed overhead in boisterous, noisy mobs every dawn and dusk has eventually become the focus of a deep-rooted fascination with the species. In a week of programmes that follows the rook's life through a whole calendar year, we've reached the summer. It may seem strange that our conventional season of plenty is the rook's time of hardship, but the subsoil invertebrates on which the birds depend sink to greater depths as the earth dries with rising temperatures, and rooks find it increasingly difficult to feed. One of the stranger hazards of the summer months is that the bird itself features briefly on our own menu. While the tradition is passing slowly from our rural customs, they were eaten widely within living memory, And rook pie involved a double bonus, since the young, tenderest birds, known as branchers, were considered good eating, while the harvest also involved control of a bird long regarded as an agricultural pest. One place that knew a steady traffic in rooks for the table was Hatton Castle, near the small town of Turriff, deep in the Aberdeenshire countryside. David James Duff, the present owner of this beautiful 15th century house, knows the rook both as a potential nuisance among his precious crops, but also as a source of natural spectacle.
I think I like the sound of them, and I like the sight of them from a distance. I mean, up close, there's nothing very attractive, I can tell you, about a rook or a crow, however you want to call them. But there is something absolutely magical about watching them coming in the evening. I mean, just huge clouds of black. And we're looking out through this window now, almost due west. And if you look straight and don't let your eyes wander, you will see black out of the left eye and black out of the right eye, and it'll be solid black in between. The numbers are prodigious. And also in the morning, they come off their roost, but before going off to the fields to eat, they congregate on most of the hardwoods, which are completely void of leaves, of course, now. We're talking about midwinter. And it is absolutely wonderful. It's like something out of Datta de Maurier. The great thing is that instead of flying into the window at us, they then go out to the fields and eat. But it's a remarkable sound and a wonderful sight.
Can a bird widely known as the farmer's friend really be a pest? Hatton Castle was certainly a good location to measure the rook's impact on agriculture, because the woods surrounding the house once held a rookery that in the 1950s numbered nearly 7,000 nests and was one of the biggest rook colonies in all Europe. David James Duff recalls what happened at the end of the breeding season, when there might be anything up to 40 or 50,000 hungry birds jostling for food in the estate grounds.
Shooting the rooks, it was a very well organised part of the year. You had to wait until the young were off the nest. But this had to be ideally before there was so much leaf cover that you couldn't see the little blighters. And they're shot with a .22 rifle. And it was organised by the National Farmers Union of Scotland and their members. And certainly before the war, we were shooting up to 14,000 rooks a year. And they would go off in hampers to Turriff. And there was a station there, sadly long since gone, and the line to Aberdeen. And into the train, off to Aberdeen, from Aberdeen to York and or Leeds, where they were processed into crow pie and exported to Italy. And it was actually quite a nice little earner for the estate. The numbers reduced dramatically. When I was a teenager, we would still be shooting 3,000 or 4,000 a year. Now I would think if we get to 1,000, that was probably about the norm. The rooks are still there, in the same sort of numbers, but they're much more widely dispersed throughout Aberdeenshire and North East Scotland. And yeah, still people go out. My keeper goes out. I haven't been out for a long time. But I've got an 11-year-old son who is being brought up very slowly with a shotgun. He's a good shot with a rifle. He shoots at the school target. And yeah, I think it would be a great shame if he doesn't at some stage have the opportunity to do this as I did. You went to your own favourite bit. When you got the rifle out, you knew perfectly well where you were going, and you shoved off there with a chum. And the only rule was that you made absolutely certain that everything you hit was dispatched and picked up, and you didn't leave wounded lying about. It was well regimented, and we were all brought up to do it properly. And I don't remember ever having a go at an adult. I know lots of people have tried. They think that these things slowly circling around are possible to hit. Well, in my experience, they most certainly are not. So just with the young. And then you would bag up your dead and take them to the collection point where they'd be counted, and this would be entered into the book.
Do people locally eat them at all? Were they ever...
Yes. Yeah, and they are absolutely disgusting. I can't describe the taste. It was just awful.
Can you remember as a child ever being served up rook pie?
No, absolutely not. No.
Can rook meat really be that unpalatable? And even if it were not, should I be seeking to eat my totem bird at all? I've come to feel that tasting its flesh may be a way of getting closer to the living creature. It'll also help me to understand the many centuries of rural custom, when a rookery on your land could be valued as an important economic and culinary asset. One of the few places where crow pie can still be found is 500 miles south of Aberdeenshire, in the Gloucestershire village of Didmarton. Here the proprietors of the King's Arm pub still keep up the old ways. Once a year in early June they prepare a traditional rook supper. But before we sample this celebrated dish, I needed to find out how we'd recognise the rook from the other ingredients in the pie. Lizzie Pearce, who works there, explains.
We've just had a discussion tonight, and I think you'll find if there's one rook on its own and there's lots of birds around it, it's not a rook. It's a crow.
In Norfolk we have a saying, if that's a rook, that's a crow. If that's crows, that's rooks.
That's what they were saying.
Which means that if it's in a flock, it's a rook, and if it's on its own, it's a carrying crow.
Yeah.
Yeah, Liz, could you tell us a little bit about how this supper started?
Okay, it was back in 1994. A local gamekeeper called Mervyn Barrett took on the fact that, they were able to shoot the rooks. He brought them to the pub, and the chef at the time decided to put this into a pie. It was quite a funny thing, but we only kept it to the gamekeeper and his close friends, and it was only, I think, 4 to 6 of them. And they enjoyed it so much, and the year afterwards it grew, and then we realised, well, this is stuff, why not open it to the public?
Are they local rooks? I mean, is the Gloucestershire
Absolutely.
rook?
Just 2 miles away is Bampton Estate, the Duke of Beaufort's land, and they're actually shot on the Duke of Beaufort's land. And as I said, the gamekeeper only lives half a mile away, and he goes out into the woods, so it's literally half a mile where they come from. So they've probably flown over the pub a few times.
The chef at the King's Head is Steve Walker.
Basically, it's more of a game pie than just a rook pie. I mean, basically, breasts are so small. I mean, they're about 1.5 inches big. So you get 50 breasts and you get next to nothing because they're so small. The recipe has sort of changed to every chef that's been here. I make it sort of quite a rich game casserole, and I put venison, pheasant, partridge, pigeon, quail. There's just a bit of everything really. Anything that I can get off the estate goes into the pie.
How are we going to know if we're eating rook then, Steve?
Well, you can see the rook because they're whole breast. I mean, they're quite small, quite a white meat. You'll see it's completely different to anything else because obviously all the rest of the meat is fairly dark.
Right. They're white, are they? I thought they were supposed to be pink, like a...
No, when they're cooked, rook's quite a white meat. It looks almost like pheasant when it's cooked.
Doesn't it?
It's quite light in colour. It's not like pigeon, where pigeon's really deep red colour when you cook it.
What about the taste of it? Do you like the flavour?
To be honest, it doesn't have a massive lot of flavour to it. I mean, it takes a lot of cooking because it is quite a tough piece of meat. So, I mean, I braise it for about 8 hours really slowly. Otherwise, it would just be almost like chewing rubber, to be honest. So I braise it for 8 hours with loads of red wine. It's got gin in it, it's got port in it, juniper berries. It takes a long time to cook it to get any sort of tenderness to it. And it hasn't got massive... It's not like pigeon, which has got real nice flavour to it, or venison or anything like that. It's just not got a massive lot of flavour to it.
Where would you place it on the hierarchy of game?
Right at the bottom. Right at the bottom. Yeah, it's just,
poor old raw.
Yeah, it's just not got the flavour. But
these are young birds. These are the young, tender, youngest birds of the year, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. Oh yeah, I said to Mark, don't get any bigger than that. He said, well, you do. He said, but you really don't. It'd take you about 20 hours to cook it, and you still wouldn't get anything in it.
That's not rook.
Find out.
Here we go. What's that? Is that it? Yeah, that's it, isn't it? That's like a breast, isn't it? Well, we've just been served with our individual rook pies. Just the breast was served. I'm just going to try it, see what it's like. It's actually rather tough, although it's been braised for 8 hours. Really nice, a sort of Slight sort of kidney flavour. Slightly gamey, slightly tough. Not particularly strong. Rather like partridge, actually. It feels very strange to be eating one. Of course, we know that these birds are young rooks, so they'd be quite tender. I wouldn't like to taste an adult because I think they would be very tough. But what we have to bear in mind is that many of these young birds face a period of a bottleneck in their lives in June when a lot of them will die anyway. So actually, although it seems cruel, the birds very often don't survive. So culling rooks in May actually have absolutely no effect on the population. So although people might feel it strange, I don't feel at all bad about eating them. And I'm going to tuck into a bit more, which I think is definitely as good as any other game bird I've tasted. But what's extraordinary is that we are literally eating what the rooks were fed a matter of weeks before, and that was essentially earthworms and the larvae of cockchafers and leatherjackets and the larvae of crane flies, and that's on our plate before us, but actually it tastes rather wonderful. I mean, I love rooks, and I spent the last 3 years probably studying this bird more intently than any other species I've ever looked at. And eating it is a curious way of possibly getting a bit closer to it, because the traditional thoughts of tribal societies is if you eat the thing that you love and that you cherish and value as a way of access to the natural world, that you somehow gain insight through eating it, like a shaman. It's interesting to eat the bird. It's possibly a way of coming to appreciate it even more, I think. I'm not sure. It's really nice.
A mouthful of rook, ending the Rook and Me. It was presented by Mark Cocker and produced in Bristol by Tim D. Tomorrow, the final programme in the Rook's year brings us back full circle to autumn.
For a year, Mark Cocker has been following his favourite bird, the rook, through its annual cycle. This most ordinary of birds gets up to some of the most dramatic spectacles of any of our British birds, yet hardly anyone notices. It's autumn in Norfolk for the Rook and Me.
It was one of those serendipitous encounters that flow from a change of address, which first brought the rook literally to my front door. Our new cottage in the country lay by chance directly beneath a flight line for roosting rooks in Norfolk's Yare Valley, and when I finally followed the caravan of birds to their nightly destination and found a flock of 40,000, one of the largest rook and jackdaw gatherings in all Britain, I was intrigued. But when they twisted over the woods in a single mesmeric swirl, like some great shoal of fish rotating in the evening gloom, this glorious bird seemed to be instantly unsheathed from its very ordinariness. I've been hooked ever since. In the last of my 4 programmes, which have tracked the rooks on a 12-month safari through their annual cycle, we have in every sense come back full circle. In winter, where we began, we watched the roost as it reached its maximum scale and drama. In spring, we watched some of the same birds in their rookeries. For summer, we headed north to the heart of Aberdeenshire and a 15th century house called Hatton Castle, once home to the largest rookery in Britain. Summer also took us to Gloucestershire and the King's Arms pub at Didmarton, whose owners still set aside an evening to celebrate that arch feast of an older English countryside, rook pie. In today's programme about autumn, we are once again in the Yare Valley to watch the rooks and jackdaws as they re-establish their old roosting and flocking habits that will help them through the intensifying shortages and ordeal of midwinter. We began our year about 9 months ago across the other side of the Yare Valley at the winter roost, which built up at that time to about 40,000 birds. 9 months later, we're about a mile from our original site on the south side of the valley, very close to my home village, and we're here to capture something which occurs at this particular time of year and quickly evaporates. Essentially, the rooks and jackdaws which we saw in the winter have gone away to breed, have re-established their relationship with the rookeries. As that comes to a close about June, the birds then form a temporary alliance with a subsidiary roost, often quite close to the original primary winter site. But these temporary autumn roosts, one of them is very close to us at a site called Mulberry Carr. It's about a mile from the main site where they gather in winter, and the wonderful thing that occurs at this time is the moment when the gravitational pull of their winter site starts to overpower them and the birds' relationship with Mulberry Carr breaks down and they start to transfer their allegiance to their primary site, which is across the river. And we're catching that moment, which is a period of extraordinary tension for the birds. There are two aspects to it which are wonderful. One is the sense of stillness in the landscape, so there's a kind of added resonance to the sounds of the birds, which is one aspect that I love particularly. And it's that end of year, it has that kind of stillness and quietness. And so the birds have a sort of added richness to their calls. But the birds are also calling intensely because they're in this state of flux or confusion between, if you like, if you see it as two planets exerting a gravitational pull upon them. You have the larger planetary pull of the winter roost, and then their temporary loyalties to their site at Mulberry Carr. And the birds are kind of drawn between the two. And sometimes you have this wonderful moment when there's a string of birds, possibly up to 2,000 in total, strung out in a rainbow line across the entire valley. One line being drawn back to their autumn site and the other being pulled to the winter site. And it's this wonderful tension that the birds almost communicate to the whole atmosphere. And one of the things they do is they call more intensely. You can often see the sense of confusion they show because they circle looking for direction from their fellow flock members. And they're pulled in all sorts of directions. And it's that wonderful moment which we're hoping to capture now. On this September evening there's a fabulous balminess. There's a calmness and quietness to September. There's no bird song. In fact, there are no distracting sounds really at all, and so the corvids, the rooks and jackdaws, seem to even stand out more powerfully. I think the other thing that's very powerful at this time of year is the mist gathering now. We can see it, the sky has turned a kind of pale pink over towards the west as the sun is setting, but there's this wonderful rising mist swallowing up the landscape, and it's a very classic part of the autumn scene. One of the dramas which occurs here to do with the conflicting loyalties which the birds show is that each roost, whether it's an autumn roost or a winter roost, is sited close to an existing rookery or a former rookery. Now in the case of Buckenham there is a small rookery adjacent to the wood where the birds gather in winter. In the case of Mulberry Carr, the rookery hasn't existed for about 20 years, and yet the birds still show this remarkable loyalty to the site. It's almost as if the former presence of breeding rooks in that wood has sanctified it for the birds and makes it a place where they feel comfortable to rest for the night. But the thing that I find intriguing is that the rookery that occurs across on the north side of the river at Buckenham Carr, throughout the winter they show their existing loyalties in the Buckenham site, but come the summer and the early autumn, they abandon the mother site, as it were, and start to use a satellite roost over at Mulberry Carr. And I find it fascinating that the birds almost have these cultural traditions, or they function like cultural traditions, inherited bits of behaviour. So the Buckenham birds that breed on that side of the river come and roost on my side, on the south side, and then at this time of year they revert to their major loyalty to the Buckenham roost. And I find it intriguing that birds should use different roosts at different seasons. I can't quite work out why one roost should exercise some kind of lure for the birds, and the old traditional roost at Buckenham ceases to function for them for about 3 months. So no birds spend their nights there. One of the interesting subdramas that's unfolding now is that because starlings are gathering amongst the larger corvid congregation, because of the birds looking for direction from their fellow flock members, they're almost using the starlings in the same way. So we find little globes of starlings flying into the sky with apparent purpose. And because they seem to have a sense of purpose and direction, one or two of the jackdaws are breaking away instantly and combining with the starlings. Of course, this has a strange dynamic in itself, because the jackdaws seem like predators to the starlings are fleeing them, and the jackdaws are chasing after them to try and latch onto them. The thing that I love is that there are a number of rituals unfolding, that there are simultaneous dramas, if you like, pursued by different species. So we've just had grey-leg geese pass over, and we know that they're going to a small lake about 4 miles away. The Egyptian geese, which are gathered on the field, are about 90 in front of us. They also, in small parties, are making the same journey to their roost site. So here we've got a flock just taking off with those sort of hoarse, wheezing calls. Then you've got overhead a sort of even larger drama of thousands of gulls heading down to Braden Estuary. And I think it's this way in which the night can only come upon us as these rituals have unfolded. It's almost without them, night couldn't happen. And I find the whole drama of it, the whole simple ritualized pattern of nightfall, a fascinating part of my whole encounter with rooks and the other birds. And of course, as the rooks are going to bed, so the owls are emerging. And so just now we had a wonderful barn owl fly down the dyke, feeding and hunting. The oscillation, or the way in which the balance has tipped back in favour of the Buckingham Car as their primary roost, has slowly taken place here. And so we're finding the birds, as they're passing over our head, we're getting thousands of birds now coming down. And there's a large front of about 200 or 300 birds. Some are showing loyalty, are now circling down over Mulberry Car, which is quite nice. But the majority have already chosen in favour of Buckingham Car, and so we have a large congregation which is almost certainly set to fly further north and return to the mother lode. But I'm still pleased to see that Mulberry Car is still exerting a residual gravitational hold on some of the flock, and so we're finding a front of birds will divide in two, a smaller section showing their loyalties to the summer and autumn side, and the majority still passing overhead towards Buckingham from one roost location to another. Look, it's a classic scenario. Half have gone one way and half have gone the other. Absolutely typical. It was interesting when I first encountered this switch from one roost to the other. It was an extraordinary day last year when I first realised that there was this very precise moment when loyalties shifted. And I remember coming down, and one of my standard procedures is to take notes copiously about the numbers that are flying in and the time that each flock arrives and the direction they're coming from. And I remember arriving at the site, and almost instantly I could sense that there was change in the air. It was actually quite a windy September evening. And it was almost as if the winds of change were blowing through the Yare Valley. And I remember finding it very difficult to distill any of the experience that I was encountering into note form. And I just simply sat back and watched this extraordinary moment. And there was a greater intensity to the way in which the birds were calling, almost as if the uncertainty which they felt themselves was manifesting itself in a more intense communication with one another. The other fascinating thing was that their flight had assumed this kind of drama. They were all whiffling down. Now, whiffling is a type of flight where the bird arrives high over the site and then suddenly tumbles down in this dramatic, almost uncontrollable fashion. And all the birds were flying around, and there was almost a sort of boisterousness, as if the birds knew that they were partaking of this, what I found, very dramatic moment. And I remember most vividly this great big rainbow arch of black birds across the heavens over the entire Yare Valley, swirling and turning like a dragon's tail almost. One part of it pulling in one direction and the other pulling in the other direction. And then even after night had fallen and Buckingham had seemed to exert a higher gravitational pull on the birds and was pulling them all to the north, I then found little clots of birds flying, sneaking back over to Mulberry Car as if they couldn't quite abandon their summer loyalties to that site. It was a wonderful moment in encountering the life of these birds. It just cemented the sense of mystery which surrounds them. Here we have a bird which is in every parish in England and Scotland, and yet I was encountering things which I'd never read of in any book, and I found it absolutely wonderful. The super thing about rooking is that from here on my year can only get better, whereas most people find autumn a rather melancholic moment. For the rook watcher, I know that the rook roost will build in numbers, will become more dramatic, the sounds will get more evocative and powerful, and we've come full circle in our journey through the rook's year, and I'm looking forward to what the next winter will reveal.
The Rook and Me was presented by Mark Cocker and produced in Bristol by Tim Dee.